Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, the series where we discuss a specific faction and its the units, lords, characters, and regiments of renown on their roster that may be a bit underperforming, underwhelming, or underutilized, and then talk about what could be done to make them better. And in this case, we are going to be talking about Skaven. Obviously, Skaven are currently a reasonably strong faction, and one that has some really nasty and frustrating gimmicks to play against. And that does kind of skew what units on the roster are deemed to be strong or viable to an extent. Certainly, if Poison Wind Globes were not available, odds are many of the other non-AP or really anti-infantry options on the roster would see much more play. And this was the case before Poison Wind Globes were a thing. And that is something I wanted to remain cognizant of when making this list. That the Skaven roster's overperformance of certain units has resulted in a sort of skew in what units are deemed valuable. However, that doesn't mean all the units on the Skaven roster are okay and just being crushed on by Poison Wind Globes. There are certainly some units that just do not perform for the price, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, obviously, first and foremost here, we got Tretch Craventail, the Lord category for Skaven, perhaps the biggest sort of pitfall of the faction at the moment. Obviously, Skaven have some excellent lords. It's not that the lords suck or that they don't have options, but some of the lord options are not very good. Tretch, Queek, as well as the Warlock Master, all a bit lackluster. And first and foremost, we're going to look at Tretch. I'm sure he's no surprise for most of you. Tretch is a pretty dapper-looking rat with his lucky skull helm, but his entire gimmick is being a survivable lord option, a cheap survivable lord option that lets you bring a very big army. But the problem is he both kind of fails at being super survivable when you need him to be, and simultaneously is not very impactful at all on the battlefield for his cost. If you want a cheap and survivable lord, a warlord on a Broodhar, who is granted a little bit underpriced at the moment, is a far better choice. Far quicker than Tretch, far more mobile, has the ability to apply fear, terror, poison, has AP stats, has a great charge bonus, and regen, which offsets the fact that he doesn't necessarily have the highest armor values. And that's before we factor in any itemization. Tretch, on the other hand, well, in straight combat, he's basically worthless. He can potentially poke down some unarmored large targets given enough time. He does have bonus versus large 25, which is pretty significant. And okay combat stats, very high melee defense. So he can potentially, in a long game, beat down, say, a giant or something, or do a decent amount of damage. Certainly more than his cost would suggest. The problem is, that is an incredibly niche use. His odds of actually getting on that large target are very low because he's got no snares, he's got no speed. And his resistance to sniping becomes kind of useless when your opponent is either not even going to bother trying to snipe you because you're not really enough of a threat. And if they do decide to snipe you, they're probably going to be picking you off at range. And at range, your one major survival item, Lucky Skull Helm, is worthless. It only applies when losing melee combat, and while 24% speed and 33% damage resist is great, if you're being leeched down by Spirit Leech, which your 3200 HP cannot tank very well, that is not helping you whatsoever. If you're being smacked by Fireball, if you're being smacked by Soul Quench, this is not helping you whatsoever. So that is definitely one, I think, major downside immediately to Tretch, is that he's not actually resistant to one of the most prevalent forms of sniping against Skaven. Sure, he's a bit more resistant to like Fireball than maybe Snitch is, but at least Snitch has innate stalk. While Tretch only gets stalk with Stay Here, I'll Get Help. Tretch also doesn't have very good support abilities. He's got Tretch's Raiders, which buffs the Skaven melee blob, which to begin with isn't that common of a sight, but also requires Tretch to be in melee continuously and winning in melee. So it's a very hefty requirement. Otherwise, you got Standard Eye, kind of generic Lord buffage. Stay Here, I'll Get Help, as mentioned, gives some leadership, and then you do have Reminisce Valor, which gives him some ability to escape from a sticky situation. Now, what could be done to make Tretch better? Now, in my opinion, the first and easiest solution actually for Tretch is to give him the Gotrek treatment. Don't keep him a lord in multiplayer, drop him down to hero tier. And I do believe in the tabletop he was a hero. I understand that in Total War, CA wants to have multiple unique lords. They want to give more faction starts and they want to flesh that out. I completely get that. Cool, that's fine. However, I think in multiplayer, some of these legendary heroes turned lords should be looked at and re-examined and perhaps downgraded in multiplayer to the hero slot. Gotrek, for example, does see a fair bit of use. He's a hero. He's a decent hero. I think as a Lord character, he would not really be a go-to. You wouldn't be taking Gotrek over, say, Volkmar. You would not take him over Faye. You would not take him over Grombrindle. He would not be a character you choose as your Lord. However, in the hero slot, he functions very nicely. I think Tretch similarly could be a solid choice in the hero slot. You could even give him, for example, the Skaven Chieftain ability, where he takes over leadership for the army if your Lord dies. You could shuffle around his costs a little bit, leave him as a non-AP, tanky, anti-large specialist, and I think you've got a character who's got himself a little bit of a niche. He could support your melee fight. Plus 9 melee attack and 12% base weapon damage is actually similar to, say, the Brass Cleaver on the Black Orc Big Boss. It's not really that crazy of an item for a hero character, so I think it's perfectly reasonable to have. Lucky Skullhelm makes him a bit tanky. He'd be a fairly pricey for a hero when you think about it, but at the same time, he could deliver in that performance without hogging up the Lord slot. Otherwise, if he is to remain a Lord, I think Lucky Skullhelm should be inactivatable, or should have an activatable mode. Maybe you can have this passive where it's losing melee, gives you a crazy buff to resistances, but I think it could also have some sort of activatable ability, something more akin to Lion's Shield, that would make him more resistant to missile fire. And magic damage, because right now it's just far too easy to snipe Tretch with Spear Leeches or with Fireball. If you really want to dedicate yourself to sniping enemy character, Tretch isn't actually resistant to that stuff. He's less resistant to magic sniping than, for example, a Grey Seer on a Furnace, and that's part of the reason you see Grey Seers on Furnaces so often. They're actually really resilient. Way more HP than Tretch. Similar armor values, much similar mobility, higher mass, so better potential to escape there. And they provide much more utility overall. So it's just one of those big downsides. Or Broodhar, even if it wasn't underpriced, the Broodhar Warlord is much more mobile. So I think making Lucky Skullhelm at least something you can trigger when you need it would be useful. I also think giving Tretch's Raiders the Grom's Language of the Boys ability, where it triggers for 30 seconds after you're winning in melee. And I know Grom's Language of the Boys is a bit insane. It doesn't even require winning. It literally just triggers when you're in melee. But forget that. Just give Tretch's Raiders the ability for like 30 seconds when he's winning in melee combat. Maybe have like a 5-second, have it that proc for 30 seconds, have like a 5-second cooldown that he needs to trigger, sort of like Nasty Skulker's Opportunist Murder, something like that. And I think it would make Tretch a much more useful support option, especially if Poison Wind Globes get nerfed a bit and you start seeing melee Skaven a little bit more again. Moving on to Queek Headtaker, I think Queek is in a bit more of a complex situation. His items aren't necessarily that terrible. He does Dwarf Gouge is okay. Warp Shard Armor is not bad. The problem is non-AP Skaven Infantry, which is really the only units that really super synergize with Queek's Warp Shard Armor, are not very common and they're not super good. Plague Monks are pretty solid. Stormwind Sword and Shield, and as we're going to discuss in a bit, a little bit overpriced. And really badly, and to boot, these units' niche is mulching infantry, and at the moment they're heavily overshadowed in that function by Poison Wind Globes. So that does raise an issue there. Sorry about that. But that does raise an issue there for the Skaven. So why would you bring Queek for a little bit of extra melee performance out of Stormwind when you're not bringing Stormwind anyway? You're bringing Poison Wind Globes and like 4 Skaven Slaves. Otherwise, the usual Vermis Valor Standard Die, or Stand Your Ground in his case. I don't know why he gets Stand Your Ground. Well, Tretch gets Standard Die. That's interesting. But same ability, doesn't really matter. So those are all good and fair and good. Trophy Heads, not a bad item at all. Bit overshadowed by Snitch there, in the sense that Trophy Heads does basically what sets up a target for sniping, but Queek isn't as good as Snitch is at snaring. He doesn't have a snare. Trophy Heads doesn't actually snare a target. Perhaps Trophy Heads could be given a small snaring component just to make it easier for Queek to get on target, and that would help him a little bit there. Otherwise, I think, well, Queek's in a obviously he's overshadowed heavily by other Skaven lords. You've got Skrulk, you've got Grey Seers, you've got Akit, you've got Snitch. Snitch is probably the most hefty competition. I think we could get a slight boost to his HP pool. If he was a bit tankier than Snitch, then in matchups where you're expecting to be sniped by Fireball or you're expecting to see pressure from this magic damage, having more HP could definitely be valuable. Could maybe give Warp Shard Armor some sort of innate magic resist component or something along those lines, something to make him a little more resilient to Lord Sniping. So that way you've got a bit of a beefier character who does provide some utility on the ground. Otherwise, I think it's going to be tough to buff Queek a decent amount. Don't want him to be too insane of a duelist. After all, he's not supposed to be like Grimgore level powerful or whatever. But I do think just giving it a little bit more HP for a rat would be nice. Put him up to like 3,600 HP. I think Skrulk, for example, has like 4,000 HP. And he's unarmored, granted. But against Spirit Leech Spam, for example, that's better tankiness than Queek. So giving Queek like 3,600 HP would, I think, be useful. Otherwise, perhaps giving a small slow component to trophy heads would be nifty as well. Make it easier for Queek to get on a target, or maybe the units that are sniping instead of Queek help them get on a target. That could make him a little bit more viable there. Next up, we do have the Warlock Master, and the Warlock Master's biggest issue is really that he's basically Ikit Claw light. Very similar ability, or almost identical abilities to Ikit. The big difference is that you get Arcane Conduit rather than unlimited power, so you've got a slightly safer but less rewarding way to get Winds of Magic. You also get Wand of Jet on top of that, so you can get some pretty significant Winds of Magic generation with this guy, which is definitely nice. In a way, better than Ikit. You do also have Control of Power, so potentially you can spam some spells, keep the Musk of Fear active going. But besides that, this character is very similar to Ikit, but you have much inferior combat stats, even on the Doom Wheel. His missile strength is much lower because Ikit actually gets multiple projectiles, where this guy only gets the one. And this guy doesn't get Storm Demon. Storm Demon, it being basically an Amber Spear with 2 casts, is really, really strong. You can tear up enemy artillery fights. Traditionally, Skaven struggle with artillery, so that actually helps offset that downside. You can do some insane poke for single targets. And actually being mounted on a Doom Wheel is kind of the ideal mount to use an Amber Spear type effect. You can roll up alongside an enemy infantry formation and turn them to paste. Warlock Master is basically a budget version of Ikit and doesn't bring anything unique to the table. It's a similar case to the Empire General compared to Karl Franz. Empire General is essentially a budget Karl Franz. Warlock Master is very similar to that in his relationship with Ikit. And I think it would be best to give the Warlock Master and Ikit maybe some separation. Personally, I think it would be cool if CA would add just like there's a Molder tag, would add a tag that says something like Clan Scryer unit or Scryer creation, and then give the Warlock Master abilities that specifically buff your ranged units. And as we can see, he already does have extra powder, so he's clearly meant to be buffing your missile units. But rather than giving him some crappy extra powder that does nothing, essentially, give him some proper ranged unit buffs. Give him something, some ability like overcharged projectiles. Maybe something that gives the unit a chance of damaging itself. Skaven Miscats were a thing on tabletop. You could give him something like supercharged projectiles or whatever. Makes a missile unit do 50% more damage, but has a chance of suffer self damage during that time period. Could be interesting. It could turn, if you're, for example, being rushed, you could pop this on a unit like Gisele's, or pop it on a unit like Warp Lightning Cannons, get an insane boost to DPS when you know you're about to be overwhelmed. And that way, yeah, you sacrificed a unit, but the unit was going to die anyway. Maybe you would lost some models. But in the process, you are able to crank out some additional damage. So it could be an ability like that. You could have you could go with the generic reload buffs. That you see, something that just increases rate of fire. Though personally, just because it's Skaven, I would like to see there being a misfire component, something that makes them fire faster and take self damage, or do more damage per shot and take some self damage in the process, or something like improved tinkering. Unit might gain in certain stats and lose in others. Have an ability to kind of swap unit stats around a bit. Get higher damage, maybe lower accuracy, that sort of thing. I think there's many cool options you could do with the Warlock Master to dabble around with the technological aspect. Even if you left it where it can affect any missile unit, even like a Slinger or whatever, I think those would be some cool options to separate them from Ikit Claw. And then maybe give Ikit some different abilities. Maybe make him, honestly, what you could, if you did go with the Scryer concept, you could even give Ikit some abilities that say buff melee-oriented Scryer units. Some melee attack buffs for Doom Wheels and Doom Flayers, essentially. And I think that would be a really neat way of distinguishing Warlock Master and Ikit, where right now, Warlock Master is just the downgraded version of Ikit Claw. So I think giving him some missile buffs would be really neat. Moving on to the hero slot, we do have Gorich, the Castellan of Helpit. And this guy is not terrible for the price. If you look at his on-paper stats, he should be fairly priced when compared to, say, a Morngul Haunter, when compared to a Carnosaur or other units in his price range. He doesn't appear to be crazy bad. I think one of the big problems, though, for Gorich in particular, or really, I should say, two big problems for him. One is the fact that he specializes against infantry. If we look here, he gets a 30 bonus versus infantry, which is insane. It means his melee deck's up to 90, and that's before we factor in Frenzy. And he does get some nice items. He gets Crown of Command. He gets an AoE magic resist. So he gets some good itemization there as well. So he's not terribly itemized. He's got an AoE damage ability as well, so he can certainly crank out a lot of damage. The problem is Skaven are already insanely overtuned at murderizing infantry, and this is going to be a continued trend with some of these other units. But Gorich is just redundant in that light. He's simply serves no purpose. So obviously there's the issue of, Poison Winning Globes are a bit too good. Other thing though, Gorich is also very flimsy for how expensive he is. Now you can heal him, but you ultimately only have 30 melee defense and 70 armor. He doesn't get the physical resist like a Mutant Rat Ogre gets. So he's actually has a lower effective HP pool than the Rat Ogre gets, which is a downside. And only 30 melee defense. It's actually lower than the Mutant Rat Ogre. So even cheap trash spears, even light cav and random units that he gets stuck, any scuffle he gets stuck in, he is taking damage in. 70 armor isn't enough to repel that amount of damage output, and 70 armor isn't enough to repel that damage output. It means he gets poked down by cheapish missiles as well. He only gets that 15% missile resist, so he's not crazy tanky against those things. He doesn't get magic damage either, so he lacks that utility of that the Mutant Rat Ogre gets. And he's just really, really flimsy for how expensive of a character he is. Especially when taken in the context of the Skaven roster. Many of the units you will see brought against Skaven are simply very, very strong against Gorich. A lot of the non-AP you see flying around will brutalize him. Plus, he doesn't bring anti-large to the table. Now, I could see one actual, I think, decent buff to Gorich would be just to swap the anti-infantry for anti-large. Make him a decent anti-large killer. His 520 weapon strength is really high. If he hit harder, he would definitely be or if he hit even more reliably, I guess, against large, he'd be more of an appealing choice. Otherwise, buffing his anti-magic aura a little bit, or making it an activatable that provides a greater resistance value would be nice, just to make it something that can repel, say, a Burning Head. Because right now, 15% magic resist, which is what that does, it can help your lords a little bit against the Spirit Leech sniping we were talking about. It can help a little bit against the Fireball sniping, but ultimately, you can just bring a tankier lord. Or hide them behind like a Plague Furnace or a Hell Pit if you really want to. And that's a cheaper option than bringing Gorich for 1700 plus, which is what he costs with just his magic resist item. So I think, as far as options for fixing Gorich, a little bit more melee defense would be nice. I think bumping his melee defense up to 40 would not be unreasonable. He is, after all, supposed to be a pretty capable combatant, or powerful combatant. So I think bumping his melee defense up to 40 wouldn't be unreasonable. Would make him a little bit more resistant to just taking damage. Otherwise, giving him some mild physical resist could also be nice. Give him like 10% physical resist would make him a bit tankier effectively. I don't think you wanted to go overboard with him because I think he is pretty close to being in a good spot. And obviously is being overshadowed a bit, but I think some mild buffs could go a long way in making him a bit more of an appealing choice. Moving on to the infantry section, we've got Stormmen. Now, I'm actually a big proponent of Sword and Board Vermin. I don't think that as half as bad of a unit as people make them out to be. However, I do think they are overpriced, and even within the context of Skaven. Obviously, Skaven are going to pay a premium for elite infantry, and that's to be expected. And obviously, as mentioned, and I keep repeating this, Poison Globes at the moment overtuned. So the incentive to bring an anti-infantry cleaving unit undermined. However, Stormmen do cost 1050 gold versus the only 1000 for the Halberd variant, which I think these guys could go down to 1000 gold. For their stats, before somebody says, oh, they've basically got the same stats as Chaos Warriors with shields, keep in mind, these guys actually, one, will beat Chaos Warriors. They've got way more models. 120 models cannot be understated. Throw them against a mid-tier infantry, and they will mulch them. Just because of how massive of a difference their model count makes. Compared to most infantry in this stat level, which is usually in the 750 to 800 gold price range, most of those infantry just get torn to shreds by Stormmen simply because Stormmen are hitting at almost double the rate. They've got 34 weapon strength, and there's 120 of them instead of the usual 75 or so. So you've got a good 2/3 bonus models going into the fight. So that is something to keep in mind. That said, I think 1050 is just a bit much. I think dropping them to 1000 would make them a little bit more appealing, would make them a little bit more cost effective, especially in the long grind. They are still a very mobile heavy infantry. 90 armor, 38 speed, puts them up on par with, or almost on par with Vestigors. When their abilities scurry away is procced, they actually are faster. When it's not, they're a bit slower, but they're very capable of threatening a backline. They're very capable of threatening and wrecking the chaff lines you will usually see against Skaven. So I don't want them to be overtuned, but I think 1000 gold would be the way to go. Otherwise, their stats could be tweaked up a little bit. You could buff their... If I was going to buff any of their stats, I think it would actually be HP. If you look at this, 7440 doesn't seem like a terrible HP pool overall, and it isn't. 7440 is over 60. It is over... sorry, most of the HP pools you'll see. It's actually higher than the majority of infantry in the game. The problem is... that it's barely over 60 HP a model. It's, I believe, 62 HP a model. So burning heads, which you see very often against Skaven, will do insane amounts of damage if they hit a unit of Stormmen. Fiery Convocation. You hit like Council Guard with Fiery Convocation, they get roasted. You hit a unit, and obviously Council Guard, if you gave Stormmen an overall HP buff, Stormmen and Council Guard would probably need a price hike. But bumping their HP up a little bit at least, just so they can resist magic damage in particular, would be nice. Would make them a bit more worthwhile. Just giving them an extra HP or extra point or two per model of HP would be decent, or maybe even a lot more HP per model. And you, at that point, they might need a price hike, but differentiate them there after all the beefier, bigger, stronger clan rats, or rats. So that could be another option. But if they're going to stay in the same, or maybe you could tweak their other stats a little bit. But in my opinion, if there's going to be any stat tweak, I'd go for HP. But otherwise, I'd just like a small price cut. I think 50 gold is decent. Moving on to Death Globe Bombs. Yeah, another unit that's basically grossly overshadowed by Poison Globes. Yada yada, usual stuff. They just cost a lot more than Poison Globes. I think they're overpriced regardless, though. I think they could take a cut of about 50 gold off their price point. Make them a little bit, just a tiny bit more cost effective. They are a very niche, very specific unit. And unlike Poison Globes, they don't retain a significant part of their damage output. Even if you lose like half their models, they do actually take a tangible loss in performance with that. So I think dropping their cost would be nice. Otherwise, maybe rework them again, which is kind of rough being like, oh, just rework them again. But maybe make them more akin to Trollheimer Torpedoes. I know that before Poison Globes used to be an anti-large specialist. Maybe make these guys the anti-large specialist. Skaven kind of lack a point defense anti-large unit. Rattling guns are the closest thing, but even they have line of sight issues. Obviously, they're paying for the suppression mechanic there. So maybe you could make these guys more akin to old school Poison Globes. Make their explosive damage much lower. Make their AP damage and missile damage much higher. Maybe give them a bonus for large. Something like that could be nice. Otherwise, and this is something I've said multiple times, though I don't believe I made a video on it, I think poison units in general, or the Skaven, like chemical weapon units, could see a general rework. Make them more of a debuffing and utility unit. More akin to, say, the White Phosphorus and Company of Heroes. Make it something that massively debuffs enemy stats, slows them down, makes it harder for missile units to shoot, that sort of thing. Make it a more punishing mechanic. And you could perhaps do something like that with Deathglow Bombardiers, but that would probably need stat adjustments as well. And maybe at that point costs would be going up or down depending on how you maintain them. Wolf Rats barely made this list. The only reason they made this list is because they got an unjustified nerf, in my opinion, in the last patch. I think their melee defense right now is 19. It used to be, I believe, 21. I think it could go back up easily. They're not... At 550 gold, if these guys were on any other roster but Skaven, this unit would be considered grossly overpriced. The reason they're considered okay is because they're on the Skaven roster. In my opinion, that last melee defense nerf was just completely stupid and unjustified. This unit already counts 550 for a unit with 34 leadership. This unit gets smacked by a unit of Light Cav and they're basically routing. This unit takes a rear charge from a terror-causing unit, you're done. A Hippogriff or especially a Griffin from Empire, for example, with the Blood Roar, yeah, you don't even take damage and you're running. Because you take the penalty for rear attack, Blood Roar, boom, your unit's terror routed. So I think this unit doesn't really need any nerfs. It could just rebuff that melee defense. Why is it so bad? Then moving on to monsters, the only one I got here is the Mutant Rat Ogre. I think it's the only one that's actually undertuned. You do occasionally see the Regiment of Renown version, because he does have some nasty AoEs, and he does have somewhat better stats. Mostly the nasty AoEs, I think. But really, my main critique with the Mutant Rat Ogre is, once again, really, really poor survivability for the cost. Unless you bring Throt for the heals, this bad boy does tend to fall apart. 60 leadership, not the greatest. Doesn't like to stick around. Costs 1,300 gold. And with only 30 armor, grand, 20% physical resist, but with only 30 armor, very easy to pepper down with cheap missiles or non-AP units. So I think the Mutant Rat Ogre could honestly just use a price cut, be 1,200 gold like the Broodhar, and it would be in a better position. It doesn't bring utility the way the Broodhar has. The Broodhar has poison. This guy does have magic damage, but might as well bring the Regiment of Renown for a couple hundred more gold. So I think just dropping the cost would be okay. Unless you want to give him some new mechanic. Maybe bumping the armor up a tiny bit, up to like 40 or 50 would be okay as well. I know that he doesn't look very armored, but this is Total War Warhammer. Chaos Trolls with armor have 110 armor, despite having like a clothing rack on their shoulders. Like, what they look like doesn't really matter. Great Swords are supposed to be clad in ground rail plate. In reality, they're like wearing basically a single plate cuirass and maybe a helmet. Floppy hats all around. So, and they get 95 armor. So I think this guy could be bumped to like 40 or 50, make him a little more resilient to poke damage, and a little bit more resilient to the traditional sort of Skaven counters that you see. And finally, artillery for Skaven. I think it's just mildly overpriced. I know some people are of the opinion that warplaning cannons should be way cheaper, that they should cost the same as normal cannons. I don't agree because of one thing, and it's actually a hidden factor that's not actually listed properly. But warplaning cannons actually fire at the advertised rate of fire. This is not true for especially Empire cannons. I don't believe it's true for Dwarf cannons either. Both of those units, due to attack animations, fire much slower than advertised. The warplaning cannon fires, I believe, about 50% faster than an Empire cannon, which means it still loses against the Empire Great Cannon because it's such a bad counter battery model. But placed into a situation where it's against a faction that doesn't have a unit that can quickly smush these models, that rate of fire does add up, certainly. But that said, I do think warplaning cannons are overpriced. I think 950 gold would probably be appropriate, maybe even 900 gold, and I think would be a bit more fair for the warplaning cannon. But I think 950 would be nice as an initial reduction. Similarly, Plague Claw catapults, really probably their closest peer is like the Blessed Trebuchet in a way, and for some reason the Blessed Trebuchet costs 50 less. These guys also do less damage per shot, and they've got I believe the same splash as a Blessed Trebuchet, but they do a bit less damage. They've got less range. You do get the Discouraged effect, but of course, Blessed Trebuchet does get the no friendly fire explosions, so something to keep in mind. I think a Plague Claw Catapult, all in all, could be an 850 gold artillery piece, and nobody would bat an eye. Would make it more competitive with mortars too. And especially with the current Skaven Slave nerf, it would be a thing that would help undo this. So one of the problems is the Skaven Slaves overperformed alongside weapon teams, and Skaven Slaves overperform alongside these mobile Skaven assets. They don't overperform that much, or really at all, with actual artillery. But now all your Skaven builds are a good 200, 300, 400 gold more expensive because of the cost nerfs to other units. So I think you could incentivize using static artillery by by removing or reducing their cost a little bit to partially undo that Skaven Slave cost nerf. So that's just my 2 cents there. Those are my recommendations on Skaven. I don't think any of their other units are in that bad of a spot. There were some I waffled on for this list. Warp Fire Throwers have always been a bit of a grim spot, but I think they're just somewhat overshadowed at the moment by Poison Globes. They've been performing much better. I've been messing around with them a lot more. I just find that I'd almost always rather have Poison Globes. Similar thing with Night Runners. I really like them in certain matchups, and though I was tempted to recommend buffing them a little bit, especially Gutter Runners, the normal non-poison ones, they are really powerful in specific matchups, and they can really do work. So those guys didn't quite make the cut. Plague Monks are pretty solid. Trying to think if there were any other units I was waffling on and didn't make it to this list. The Master Assassin was one I waffled on, but I like him. I use him a lot in several builds that are somewhat memey, but I just find him to be a decent character to use. So yeah, that's what we're left with. As always, guys, let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you agree, disagree, think this list is terrible, or have other suggestions on what could be done to improve Skaven, certainly let me know. I'd love to hear it. If you think there's units I should have included and I omitted, or maybe units that need looking at, whether or not they're overpowered or just in an awkward position, certainly let me know. I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts and opinions are, and I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.